Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or wherever you are in the world. We're so very happy to have you all here today for the final panel for our final day of the United Nations Environment Program and Global Network for Human Rights in the Environment, for our School on Human Rights in the Environment. It's always a mouthful when I say that. This year, our theme is water from oceans to taps, looking at all of the aspects of water as it intersects with human rights.
We are so very excited to open this panel today entitled Bioenergy and Carbon Capture with Storage and its Potential Implications for Human Rights, which looks to outline how application of a human rights-based approach could provide a mechanism to reconcile the objectives of potential climatic impacts with negative emissions while protecting the human rights of potentially affected individuals and groups. We have just a couple housekeeping matters before we get started. Firstly, we are recording this session. If anyone does not want to appear on the recording, please just keep your camera off. We also have closed captions enabled for this session, so if that would be helpful to you, please enable that on the bottom of your own screen. The chat is open. Please feel free to use the chat to say hello, introduce yourself. If you have any questions or points of clarification during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat for that. But we will also have an opportunity at the end of the session for some discussion as well. You also have a reactions button on your screen. If you want to raise your hand or give us a smiley face or thumbs up during the session, feel free to do that. Lastly, please let us know if you have any technical difficulties or if any questions arise during the presentation that we can assist with. All right, without any further ado, we would love to hand over this session. So over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone who has joined us to discuss this topic. I just want to say at the outset that I think that it's very important for members of the human rights community, if they have not taken note of this emerging suite of technologies called carbon dioxide removal as a potential response to climate change into account, that the time has truly come. I think that even a couple of years ago, given the huge number of priorities that the human rights community has, that this would have been largely a notional sort of topic to be discussed. But as I think, hopefully, I'll lay out in here, we've now reached an inflection point where this is a topic that is going to likely emerge very rapidly in the climate policy making community, and it has, in my opinion, huge implications for better or worse in terms of impacts on human rights. So I'm glad you've joined us, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Okay, let's start off with a brief introduction to frame this topic itself. So first of all, I'm going to share my screen. All right, so in the past decade, there's been a substantial focus at the international level on the nexus of human rights and climate change. But virtually all of that focus has been on the potential impacts of climate change in terms of undermining human rights. We see this in terms of the Human Rights Council resolution in 2011, right, that talks about the realization of human rights that are implicated by climate change related impacts. However, one of the most striking aspects of the Paris Climate Agreement's preambular language, its introductory language on human rights, is that it departs from this strong focus on the human rights implications of climate change impacts to a focus on the interface of human rights and the implications of measures to respond to climate change, right? So if you look at this language here, it acknowledges climate change as a common concern of humankind, and it says that parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights. And then it suggests some of the specific ways that this could be done. Now, while this is important, one of the things to emphasize is that preambular language in a treaty under international law is not binding unless the treaty so specifies. And this treaty does not, right? So this is not legally binding language on the parties. However, it does provide guidance in interpreting substantive provisions of the treaty, and thus certainly has some importance. Moreover, if you look at Article 4, there is, and this is a legally binding provision of the treaty, it talks about the fact that parties should take into consideration the impacts of response measures in terms of parties with economies most affected, particularly developing country parties. And whereas the emphasis or the intent initially in this context was on the negative impacts on the economies of oil-producing states, I think this language is broad enough to potentially take into account all potential responses on developing countries of the ways that we respond to climate change. There's also a framework within the Paris Agreement that can help us to try to flesh out the potential human rights implications of our responses to climate change. And this is the Committee of Experts on the Impacts of the Implementation of Response Measures that provides a framework to do this. At the same time, on the human rights side of the equation, the UN Human Rights Council has also tasked HRC's Special Rapporteur on climate change with considering this issue. This is a resolution probably many of you have seen that was passed in October of last year. And part of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur, as you can see, includes the human rights implications of the design and implementation of mitigation and adaptation policies, right? So both how we seek to mitigate and how we adapt, and the potential implications on human rights. Yet, while we have this language in both the Paris Agreement and this HRC mandate, what is not clear is how to operationalize these human rights obligations in terms of how we respond to climate change. And I think that's an important next step. So the purpose of this presentation today is to suggest a framework for operationalizing both the Paris Agreement's human rights language in terms of response measures, as well as the mandate of the Special Rapporteur, and using as a case study an emerging suite of technological responses to climate change that are collectively known as carbon dioxide removal approaches, or CDR, and then more specifically, drilling down and looking at the implications of one specific technological approach called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. And here's how I will proceed. First of all, I'm going to talk about the potential impacts of bioenergy and carbon capture in terms of human rights. Second of all, talk about the description of a human rights-based approach to assess the climatic impacts and response impacts of this approach, and apply this to BECCS, and then more broadly, seek to talk about implications beyond this. So as a bit of framing at the outset, the Paris Agreement established the salutary goal of seeking to hold temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and at least aspirationally to 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, the pledges that countries have made to date, the so-called nationally determined contributions, do not put us on track to do that. Indeed, more recent studies have indicated that we may still be on track for temperature increases of somewhere between 2.8 and 3.4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th assessment report, a central projection is about 3 degrees Celsius. What we know is that temperature increases of this magnitude can be potentially catastrophic in terms of human institutions and ecosystems. For example, a 3 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures could result in a complete melting of the Greenland ice sheet. And the melting of this ice mass alone could result in sea level rise of 7 meters. The good news is that would take about 1,000 years to transpire. The bad news is that it would then lock us into that sea level rise for 10,000 years or more. Virtually all of the world's coral reefs, which provide critical habitat for about 1/3 of all ocean species, could disappear if temperatures rise above 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. A 3 to 4 degree Celsius increase in temperatures, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, could threaten as many as 60% of the world's species with extinction. A 3 degree Celsius increase in temperatures could have catastrophic implications in terms of agricultural production, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And once we cross this climatic threshold, we're essentially stuck with the implications for hundreds and perhaps thousands of years. There's increasing recognition as a consequence that in addition to aggressively decarbonizing the world's economy and at a much more rapid pace than we are now, we will most likely need large-scale utilization of an emerging approach called carbon dioxide removal. And I just want to start off with a working definition from the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, right? CDR refers to anthropogenic activities, right? So human activities that remove carbon from the atmosphere and durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs. These can be places such as abandoned or exhausted coal mine seams, saline aquifers, oil reservoirs, or so forth, or under the world's oceans, or utilize it in products. For example, incorporating carbon dioxide into cement for long-term storage, used to create hydrogen, used to create high-strength materials. One of the things I want to emphasize at the outset is the distinction between CDR and CCS. CCS, carbon capture with storage, involves the capturing of greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, at the point source, at the flue stack, right? So for example, in a coal-fired power plant where the coal is combusted and the CO2 is released in the flue gas, the CO2 is captured at that point. By contrast, most of the carbon dioxide removal approaches remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then we seek to use sequestration. So it's a very different approach, and these two are often conflated. Now, there's been three primary rationale that have been advanced for why we would utilize carbon dioxide removal. The first of these is to offset continuing emissions from so-called hard-to-abate sectors. We have certain sectors where electrification or a movement to renewables, for example, is much more difficult than it is in other contexts. This includes steel making, for example, where the high heat requirements make it very difficult to transition from the use of coal, for example, or natural gas to renewable energy. The agriculture sector, right, which accounts for a massive amount of emissions, and where it's very difficult to reduce those emissions through any of the approaches that we have. The aviation sector, again, where it's very difficult to move to a renewable model, right? This fact is acknowledged in the Paris Agreement itself in Article 4 that talks about achieving a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removal by sinks, right? It acknowledges that some sources for a long time, if not forever, will continue to exist in terms of emissions. And what we should seek to do is enhance sinks, things that take up carbon dioxide, right? Of which carbon dioxide removal is a genre, to try to balance out those emissions. A second rationale for carbon dioxide removal is to extract legacy carbon dioxide emissions from the atmosphere, to bring atmospheric concentration levels back to acceptable levels. So if we believe that the levels are higher than we wish them to be, and we wish to bring them down even further, carbon dioxide removal potentially provides us with an option to do that. And then finally, many studies see a role for carbon dioxide removal in so-called overshoot scenarios. And the idea here is that if concentrations of carbon dioxide exceed what we would deem to be desirable and result in temperature increases above the Paris Agreement objective of 2 degrees Celsius, carbon dioxide removal can help us take enough carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to reduce radiative forcing to a point where we come below those temperature thresholds again, right? We call this an overshoot scenario. Now, one of the things to emphasize about an overshoot is that even, of course, if you can bring temperatures back down below that threshold, it doesn't mean that life is like it was before, right? There may have been irreversible impacts that occurred when we exceeded the 2 degrees Celsius threshold. There may be nonlinear responses in the climate system at that point that result in irreversible impacts. So it is not a desirable approach, but it is definitely one of the ways that we're talking about utilizing this that is better than perhaps the alternative. If you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's recent studies, the 5th assessment report and the 6th assessment report, they emphasize the exigency for carbon dioxide removal and indeed large-scale deployment of these approaches. If you look at the 5th assessment report, they ran thousands of models and of scenarios, right? The so-called integrated assessment models, and seeking to establish scenarios that could hold temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius based on a combination of factors, right? Efforts to address population, efforts to address emissions from other sectors, short-lived climate factors, and so forth. Of those thousands of scenarios that sought to hold temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius, there were only 208 of them that were able to do that. And of those 208 scenarios that held temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius, 184 of them assume deployment of carbon dioxide removal as part of meeting those objectives, right? And in those cases, they were emphasizing 2 approaches. One is afforestation and reforestation, and the one that we're going to look at today, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Now, the 6th assessment report spent even more time on carbon dioxide removal. And in its working group 3, it identified what it calls 7 specific pathways, which are termed illustrative mitigation pathways that seek to achieve temperatures held at 1.5 degrees Celsius, and 3 others that keep temperatures likely below 2 degrees Celsius. Of those 7 IMPs that were able to do that, only one of them did not require the use of carbon capture. And that one, quite frankly, is unrealistic. It would require global energy demand to actually be reduced by 50% in the next 30 years. So for all intents and purposes, the IPCC now believes that carbon dioxide removal has to be part of the equation. And to what extent? Well, this is sobering also. To a very large extent, right? According to the IPCC and a number of other studies, it is now projected that by the end of the century, we may need to be sequestering, removing from the atmosphere somewhere between 13 to 20 gigatons, that is billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every year, okay? And let me put a gigaton in perspective, because it's kind of an abstract sort of concept. If you think about a gigaton in terms of weight, it is as much weight as all human beings on Earth, or it is as much weight as all non-human species on Earth, right? And that's 1 gigaton, right? And we're talking about somewhere between 13 to 20 gigatons annually by the end of the century, as well as reaching a net zero in terms of emissions sooner than that, right? And you can see this analysis here, right? Including the 6th Assessment Report's Working Group 3 analysis that says that the deployment of CDR to counterbalance hard to abate residual emissions is unavoidable if net zero CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions are to be achieved. Now, despite this fact that we're likely to require massive amounts of CO2 removal to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, the other thing that needs to be emphasized is that deployment of this approach is in its total infancy. Right now, we are sequestering about 0.1 gigatons of carbon dioxide annually, right? And so the great scale up is likely to occur over the course of the next few centuries, right? And that's why I think, again, it's important to look at the potential negative impacts that this approach could have if not carefully deployed, including in the context of human rights. Okay, so when we talk about carbon dioxide removal approaches, what approaches are we talking about, right? And they fit into 3 broad categories: natural, combined, and technological, right? The natural approaches, we've already talked about one of those: afforestation and reforestation, the idea of planting trees. There are extensive proposals, for example, to massively expand the planting of trees as a means to utilize the photosynthetic process to remove carbon dioxide removal from the air. One recent study indicated that it would be possible, for example, to plant 900 million hectares of land in trees, and that could reduce atmospheric concentrations of CO2 by 25%. Biochar, a process of taking residual biomass, burning it in a low oxygen or no oxygen environment, creating a charcoal that would be far more recalcitrant, would hold CO2 for hundreds or thousands of years, as opposed to it being released very quickly in biomass that was not so treated. Soil carbon sequestration, efforts to increase the uptake of carbon dioxide and the holding of carbon dioxide in soils through approaches such as no-till agriculture, wetlands approaches. The one that we're going to look at today, which is deemed a combined approach because it has a natural component and a technological component, BECCS, and we'll talk more about it in a moment. Accelerated weathering on the technological side, the idea of grinding up silicate-rich minerals such as olivine or wollastonite, for example, and placing it on surfaces so that it can react with carbon dioxide, take that carbon dioxide up, convert it to carbonates and bicarbonates that ultimately will end up in the oceans and result in substantial reductions of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Direct air capture, an approach that utilizes large filtration systems to take in CO2, separate it out, and then ultimately store it or utilize it. Ocean-based approaches, such as ocean alkalinity enhancement, the idea that introducing minerals that can increase the alkalinity of the ocean will allow the oceans to take up more CO2, which will allow more CO2 to enter from the atmosphere, resulting in a drawdown in CO2. These are all approaches that are being looked at. The one that I'm going to focus on today from the standpoint of human rights is BECCS. And I focus on BECCS because, as I indicated before, it is one of the most prominent of the carbon dioxide removal approaches that's being talked about. So a brief introduction to what BECCS is. So BECCS entails the use of biofeedstocks. This can be dedicated energy crops, for example, such as switchgrass or miscanthus. It can be forests. It can be forest residues. Whatever it is, these feedstocks are used to produce energy. And this could be in the form of heat production, for example, liquid fuels. Ethanol is a quintessential example of this, or electricity production. The CO2 that's produced from combusting this biomass is then captured in a carbon capture and sequestration system, the kind that we talked about before. And the CO2 is then compressed into a liquid form, and it can be shipped through things such as pipelines, for example, or trains for storage terrestrially or in the oceans, or for utilization. BECCS is denominated as a NET, or a negative emissions technology system. And the reason that it is so denominated is that it supposedly results in a net decline in atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide, right? So if you look at the chart on the left here, for example, energy production from fossil fuels obviously is carbon positive, right? It results in a decided net increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? If you look at fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage, where we seek to capture the CO2 from the flue stack, we deem that to be a system that is less than positive, right? It results in a decrease in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. If you look at renewable energy, right, again, substantially reduces the amount of CO2 released into the atmosphere, moves us toward a neutral moment. But bioenergy with carbon capture potentially results in a net decline in atmospheric levels of CO2. And the reason is that when we plant the biofeedstocks, such as trees, for example, or crops, it takes CO2 out of the atmosphere. And whereas that CO2 is released when we combust it, the capture system removes that CO2 from the atmosphere, and we plant more bioenergy feedstocks, taking more CO2 from the atmosphere. So at least in theory, it can result in a substantial net decline in atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide. All right. Now, on the other hand, why are we concerned about BECCS in the context of human rights? Well, it turns out that BECCS has some serious risks, and these are risks that are, I think, most importantly displayed in the context of human rights. So, first of all, I want to start off with the right to food, right? Right to food is obviously a fundamental human right that is outlined in all elements of the so-called Human Rights Bill of Rights, right? Universal Declaration, and both the covenants, and in a number of other instruments of that nature. Large-scale deployment of BECCS, I would argue, could contravene this right to food in several ways. First of all, large-scale deployment of BECCS could require diversion of large swaths of agricultural land for bioenergy feedstock production. Even delivery of a relatively modest 3 gigatons of CO2 capture. And remember, we're talking about ultimately needing, perhaps 13, 15, or 20 gigatons a year. But even removing 3 gigatons annually of CO2 from the atmosphere by using BECCS, it's been estimated, would require a land area of approximately 380 to 700 million hectares in the year 2100. To put this in perspective, this would translate into 7 to 25% of agricultural land and 25 to 46% of arable and permanent crop area. And this would assuredly conflict with increasing demands for food that call for 10 to 20% more cropland in the next few decades to satisfy requirements of population growth. This would adversely impact the human right to food in at least 2 ways. First, recent studies have indicated that large-scale deployment of BECCS could result in a net decrease in calories for some of the world's most vulnerable populations by actually reducing physical access to food. In many of the areas that might be privileged, for example, for bioenergy feedstocks, such as sub-Saharan Africa, given the areas that are available, as well as the costs of deploying in that approach. Second of all, it could deny access to food by massively raising food prices for the world's most vulnerable. One recent study said that a deployment of BECCS at a level of 3 gigatons could increase food prices on basic foodstuffs for the world's most vulnerable populations by 30 to 40%, right? Which could have huge implications. And we have empirical historical evidence of this. In 2007, 2008, when the European Union increased its biofuels production, it was one of the factors that resulted in large spikes in food prices in developing countries and led to food riots in several nations. And quite frankly, that was on an extremely small scale compared to what we would be talking about in terms of large-scale deployment of BECCS. Now, proponents of this approach argue that we may be able to get around this by utilizing things such as degraded lands, right? Or using residues from crops. But that's not likely to be true in a large-scale deployment approach. First of all, it turns out, probably to no one's surprise in the human rights community, that a lot of the areas that are classified as degraded are a source of important livelihoods for a lot of people, especially indigenous tribes. And so that's a tricky proposition. Crop residues are assuredly a source of bioenergy production, but it turns out that residues are also an important source of nutrients that are often left on crops and plowed back into the system for that very reason. So if you were to remove those residues, it would likely result in a substantial decrease in crop yields, which would probably require expanding croplands into other areas, right, which could have negative biodiversity impacts, and also would result in substantial increases in carbon dioxide, right? And also might be a more expensive proposition. So it's likely to be that the primary early focus would be on dedicated energy crops, especially if we were going to use it at a large scale. A second potential human right implicated in terms of a large-scale deployment of BECCS is the human right to water, right, which is recognized in a number of instruments also. The United Nations General Assembly also recognized this right in a resolution in 2010, and many others recognize the human right to water as a corollary right to the human right to life, given the necessity of water to fulfill this right, and the same with food. BECCS could potentially imperil the human right to water in a number of ways. First of all, BECCS would require tremendous amounts of water in various segments of its operation. This includes growing the bioenergy feedstocks itself, as well as demands in the plants themselves that would be used in the BECCS process. By 2100, studies indicate that BECCS feedstock production at scale could require 10% of the current evapotranspiration from all global cropland areas, or of the same magnitude of all agricultural water withdrawals on Earth, right? And so this is at a time, of course, when demands for water are likely to be increasing as a result of projected increases in population. This could strain already severely limited water resources for millions. It could reduce crop production, and it could substantially increase water degradation in some areas. Moreover, large-scale deployment of BECCS would require large additional amounts of fertilizer use, which would also have implications for water availability. Recent studies have indicated that meeting the scenario under the IPCC that would hold temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius would require increasing fertilizer use somewhere between 42 to 84% above current levels to utilize so-called second generation bioenergy feedstocks such as miscanthus and feedgrass. Additional nitrogen-rich fertilizer applications would exceed soil denitrification capacities and produce a large additional non-point pollution source in groundwaters, which again could contravene the human right to water. Two more. The human right to health, right? Again, recognized in a large number of human rights implications. The large-scale deployment of BECCS could undermine this right in several ways. First of all, it could result in substantial diminution of biodiversity through habitat destruction associated with carving out land for bioenergy feedstocks. One recent study indicated that the biodiversity impacts of large-scale deployment of BECCS could be equivalent to increasing temperatures by about 2.8 degrees Celsius. This loss of biological diversity could undermine the right to health by leading to an increase in the transmission of infectious disease, such as hantavirus, Lyme disease, and schistosomiasis. It could also undermine health in terms of water contamination in the ways that were described above. And then finally, large-scale deployment of BECCS could undermine the human right to subsistence, again, recognized in both of the covenants in terms of human rights. And this could be in several ways. First of all, it could result in huge land grabs, in many cases extra legally, as has already been seen in efforts to expand biofuel production for European markets and for other resources. This could undermine vulnerable populations who rely on such lands for economic subsistence, including forestry resources. Diminution of biodiversity, as we indicated above, could also deny vulnerable critical resources that many rely for their livelihood. It could result in conversion of forests and other important ecosystems, such as prairie grasslands, to bioenergy feedstocks. It would make it easier for invasive species to gain toeholds in certain ecosystems, which would crowd out indigenous species in ways that, again, would reduce access to critical resources. So in the face of what is a dilemma at this point, right? A recognition that if we're to address climate change, we have now reached a point that we are likely to need large-scale deployment of carbon dioxide removal, but at the same time, recognizing that carbon dioxide removal could have some huge potential implications in terms of human rights. How do we seek to square that circle? And the argument that I would make is that a human rights-based approach would help us to operationalize the Paris Agreement's language that says that in responding to climate change, and carbon dioxide removal would certainly be a response mechanism to climate change, one must take into account human rights and thus try to reconcile large-scale deployment of CDR with human rights measures in a way that, quite frankly, might not happen unless we place this critical lens on these emerging technologies. So most of you in this audience are obviously already well apprised of what a human rights-based approach is, right? It seeks to protect individuals and groups in society, especially the most vulnerable, by prescribing human rights parameters, right, that influence the objectives and the goals of public policymaking in a way that might not otherwise occur. It seeks to ensure the identification of goals, objectives, targets, and indicators that are consistent with human rights, whatever the policy measures are that we're seeking to prescribe. It seeks to formulate human rights compliant strategies and policies. And it seeks to monitor and evaluate the protection of human rights throughout the operation of the project or policy that might be implemented. It is thus unlike some incarnations of human rights, a prospective approach that seeks to prevent human rights violations from being perpetrated rather than focusing on the consequences of the violations of human rights. In the context of carbon dioxide removal, I would argue that this would be a salutary approach to try to ensure that deployment is not driven purely by the economic interests of elites in either developed or developing countries, or that the pursuit of climate objectives is not placed on the backs of only certain sectors of society. So the hallmarks of a human rights-based approach are the following, right? In the formulations of policies and programs, the main objective should be to fulfill human rights, right? In this regard, principles and standards derived from international human rights law should guide all policies and programming in all phases of the project. There needs to be a focus on the relationship between rights holders and duty bearers. There needs to be a need to identify gaps in legislation, institutions, and policies that may result in human rights being contravened in the deployment of these kinds of approaches. And the goal should be that the most vulnerable can influence decisions that have impact on their lives. This human rights approach, of course, has been embraced to date by international, national, and subnational government and non-government organizations in a wide array of contexts, including health, development, and environmental protection. And so there is precedent for establishing a human rights-based approach to help guide us in potential deployment of BECCS and other carbon dioxide removal approaches in the future. And I would suggest that these should be the elements in a human rights-based approach that in the context of BECCS, right? First of all, there should be identification of the human rights claims, rights of the rights holders and corresponding human rights obligations of duty bearers, right? In this presentation, in the context of BECCS, for example, I sought to do that, right? Obviously, this would have to be done in a more granular fashion, right? Based on the areas in which this would be deployed to make it a realistic exercise in any individual jurisdiction. But this would provide the idea of doing it. Second of all, there would be a need for the assessment of the capacity of rights holders in this context to claim their rights and duty bearers to fulfill their obligations. We have to identify who those are, right? Who are the rights holders that are pertinent if we decide, for example, to massively deploy BECCS and produce huge amounts of bioenergy feedstocks from certain areas, right? That might require diversion of forest lands, for example, or croplands, and choices in terms of where that might be done, and considerations of what drives those decisions, right? That go purely beyond economics, right? Or the fact that there are supple elites in an area, right, that will easily permit this. And also, there has to be prioritization of the rights of the most vulnerable, right? This is critical in this context, right? If this does not happen, the carbon dioxide removal approach, as has been true with so many other approaches, including responses to climate change, will be driven by other considerations, right? Primarily cost, but other things also that will not seek to protect the interests of the most vulnerable, and so ensuring that that is an element that is strictly scrutinized in any early decision making, in my mind, is critical. A couple of other elements that I think are critical here would be monitoring, right? This is going to have to be something done on an ongoing basis, right? If we're talking about deploying carbon dioxide removal at scale, we're talking about a commitment for a century or more, right? And so we're going to need ongoing monitoring of the decisions that are made in terms of where we source bioenergy feedstocks, how we protect resources such as groundwater, for example, in those deployments, and so forth. And then finally, and one of the most difficult, I would suggest, is we're going to need a comparative human rights assessment component, right? The reality is, of course, that as we talked about at the beginning, unchecked climate change also has huge negative impacts on human rights, right? As human rights bodies have acknowledged. And in these cases, it may be that there are circumstances under which those that would potentially have their human rights contravened by the deployment of BECCS, for example, also could have their human rights undermined by unchecked climate change or business as usual scenarios, right? And so we need also to recognize trade-offs in these cases and try to ameliorate any of the potential impacts of deployment, but acknowledge that in some cases, those trade-offs may actually be acceptable and perhaps even salutary, okay? Now, there are obviously challenges to implementing a human rights-based approach to carbon dioxide removal, right? The intrinsic challenge is that of enforcing human rights themselves, right? As one commentator noted recently, human rights, once set down on paper, never die, even though no one may care much about their survival, right? And that's a reality, right? So how we fortify a human rights-based approach and ensure that it is actually enforced in the deployment of these approaches is going to be a challenge, especially because the rhetoric is going to be that everybody needs to get out of the way because we're trying to save the world, right? And that's the kind of language that we all already hear often in the CDR community. In this context, it's going to be important for the climate change community, which is quite powerful, to support an application of a human rights-based approach, right? And so efforts need to be made to increase the importance of human rights-based considerations within the Paris Agreement, for example, in a way that may not be totally acculturated at this point. A second issue is whether human rights instruments impose obligations extraterritorially. That is, are states responsible if their actions allegedly violate the human rights of citizens in other states, right? And that's an important consideration in the context of BECCS and a lot of other carbon dioxide removal approaches. For example, if a country seeks to meet part of its NDC, its pledge under the Paris Agreement, by the deployment of BECCS, right? But it is sourcing those feedstocks from sub-Saharan Africa, right? And it's the United States or the European Union. And that results in undermining of human rights. Is the United States or the European Union responsible, right, under human rights instruments? Most human rights instruments, as you know, focus on obligations of the state in which the residents that are allegedly injured reside, right? And it talks about each state party ensuring to all individuals within its territory and subject to its jurisdiction these rights, right? However, at least one human rights treaty, right, provides for a broader potential interpretation, right? It talks about states taking steps individually and through international assistance and cooperation, right? And so the argument could be made, for example, that if a country like the United States or a bloc such as the European Union was massively drawing on bioenergy feedstocks from a vulnerable country, and it massively increased food prices, for example, or massively undermined the environment or health in that country, that would contravene the obligation to cooperate to protect human rights throughout the globe, and thus might have some extraterritorial obligation. One can also try to argue that this extraterritorial obligation in terms of human rights is found under the UN Charter. Article 55 talks about, for example, universal respect and observance of human rights, right? And to the extent that one's decision 3,000 miles away in the context of deployment of these approaches could undermine human rights in other countries, arguably is a violation of Article 55, right? Another potential option may be for national actors or subnational actors to establish human rights frameworks related to human rights, right? For example, the state of California has signed an MOU with several states in Mexico to try to link the RED Plus program in Mexico to the carbon trading program in California. There hasn't been a lot of substantive discussion about including human rights in this context, right? But it is something that could be done, right? And so individual countries or subnational entities could seek to ensure that a human rights approach was incorporated into these processes, right? And this approach could also be folded into approaches that are already invariably going to be required in the context of large-scale deployment of both BECCS and other approaches. For example, environmental impact assessments, right, which are de rigueur virtually anywhere in the world, could be amended to include a human rights-based approach assessment as part of that approach, and with substantive consequences. The last thing that I'll say, and then open it up to questions, is that human rights issues are likely to be pertinent for a lot of the other carbon dioxide removal approaches that we're talking about deploying in the future. Afforestation and reforestation, right? If you wanted to deploy trees at a level that's 900 million hectares above where we are now, right? It's likely to result in lots of potential land grabs, lots of taking away of areas such as savannas and prairie grasslands that are high in biodiversity, for example, and also provide critical livelihoods for a lot of people, especially indigenous peoples, right? It will have human rights implications that should be taken into account, and a human rights-based approach may permit us to do that. Accelerated weathering, this idea of creating huge amounts of mineral dust that can take up CO2 and spreading it on the ground, beyond having potential health implications, because we're talking about very small particles that are now going to be introduced in the atmosphere. This could require a mining industry that is as large as the hard rock mining industry that exists right now, right? And we know about the human rights implications that often occur in terms of large-scale mining operations, right? So again, a focus early on the human rights implications of this approach could be extremely important. Direct air capture is likely to require large amounts of water, for example, and we're going to need to look at that. Ocean alkalinity enhancement could have some potential negative impacts in terms of fisheries, right? And this could undermine the right to food or the right to subsistence, and again, would give rise to this kind of approach. And so, you know, I want to be realistic at the end of the day, right? I don't believe that any of this is or should stop carbon dioxide removal from being considered as a response measure, because quite frankly, the world did not get its crap together in time and do the right thing so that we didn't have to look at these approaches, right? We are now left with considering how these approaches can be deployed. And so I don't harbor the notion that we won't look at these approaches or we shouldn't look at these approaches. But what I think a human rights based lens can do is help us to acknowledge trade-offs, acknowledge values other than purely going with the easiest route from a political standpoint or the cheapest route to deploy these approaches, to one that at least seeks to try to balance the interests, especially the most vulnerable, against the salutary goals of addressing climate change. And I'm hoping that this approach is one potential way to do that. And with that, I will stop for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Burns, for that incredible lecture. We have many questions in the chat, much engagement. which is really great. So we can start off with people who have raised their hands and then move through the questions in the chat, if that sounds okay with you.
That's great.
Okay, great. Hannah, if you want to unmute and say your question.
Hi, I'll lower my hand now, just so that's not detracting from future questions. Yeah, so many thanks for a very interesting presentation, and I apologize for a little bit of a lengthy question. I don't detract from the importance of natural CDR approaches, but arguably technological CDR and geoengineering is respectfully one of the latest ways of distracting from the necessity of an urgent, fair fossil fuel phase out and just transition. And I wonder if we overlook this reality as potentially gambling on overshoot, which is dangerous for human rights, because even if we hit temporary overshoot, that's a major problem. And I know that human rights organizations, including several of those who have made submissions to the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee on this matter, have noted that we cannot keep going along business as usual and rely on a massive and unprecedented scale of carbon removals in the future, as opposed to stopping this at the source, a fossil fuel phase out. So I'm wondering what your response is to this point, given that the technologies that would have to be involved and the climate system and carbon cycle responses to it are not a certain strategy. And I think you've outlined some potentially pretty serious human rights impacts. And I know that you mentioned that it's not clear how to operationalize some of these human rights obligations in response to climate change, but there's actually a fair bit of guidance on this. So yeah, to summarize, I'm wondering, should we be gambling on geoengineering, CDR, and overshoot as a method full stop, and in ways that will, as indicated, have uncertain impacts on vulnerable and non-vulnerable communities worldwide, rather than just working on a fossil fuel phase out?
Yeah,
Thank you.
no, it's an excellent question. It's one I struggle with all the time, right? I've been working in this field of geoengineering. There's people in the carbon removal community that don't want to call this geoengineering, right? They argue that solar radiation management is geoengineering. This isn't. I think it's irrelevant, right? In many ways, it is large-scale intervention, right, to address the climate, whatever way it is, right? And it has large-scale implications, right? And one of them is, as you suggest, this so-called moral hazard, right? This idea that if we believe we have a way to save our bacon, that will worry less about phasing out fossil fuels, or we'll lock ourselves into a new generation of fossil fuel production, and that given the huge value of those assets that would be stranded, it won't be realistic from a political or an economic standpoint, right? But this is the dilemma that we face. And again, it's the fault of our generation, it's the fault of our parents' generation, that we now are at a point where we have a paradox, which is carbon dioxide removal is a threat as a distraction from addressing the core issue, which is decarbonizing the economy. But at the same time, as the IPCC has indicated, also needs to be done in conjunction with fossil fuel phase out, or we can't meet 2 degrees Celsius, right? Almost nobody doesn't believe that that's true at this point, right? There are scholars such as Mark Jacobson at Stanford, right, who have put out scenarios in which we don't use carbon removal, but they assume, for example, that we phase out, meat production in the world, right? We massively decrease energy production, right? At a time when a lot of people in the world face energy poverty, right? I don't think it's realistic. I think there has to be a role for carbon removal. At the same time, you're absolutely right. Fossil fuel companies are already trying to use this as a get out of jail card. A lot of the net zero pledges by corporations by the year 2050 assume large scale use of carbon removal. And this is, in many cases, technologies that are in their infancy and being developed, right? Things like direct air capture, right? That could be one of the really large ones in our toolbox. Very early stages, right? We just had the largest direct air capture plant established in Iceland, and it was ballyhooed, right? but it captures 4,000 tons of CO2 a year. And we're talking about needing to capture 13 to 20 billion tons, right? So it's very early stages, right? And so it's by no means clear that these things will scale up in time, right? So how do you reconcile those two, right? And people are struggling with that. The European Union has one approach. They're developing a directive on carbon removal that limits the amount of carbon removal that countries can claim as part of their meeting of the EU's new climate directive, emissions reductions objectives, to about 5 million tons of CO2, right, by 2030, right? And then that'll be revisited, right? So that might be one way to do it, is to two-track this, right? But if you're going to need it at a very large scale, you can't do that forever, right? Others are trying to establish metrics that require that individual sectors, for example, have to establish that they have done everything they can from a technological standpoint within economic reasonability to reduce their emissions before they can even look at carbon removal as part of the way to meet their objectives, right? We can try to enforce those kind of things. We're going to have to be extremely careful because economically, there's going to be a lot of justification for some of these things to be enshrined so that countries and companies can meet their objectives in a way that's cheaper, or in which they can plausibly claim that they're going to meet these objectives in a way that they couldn't in terms of their current trajectories of decarbonization. So the questions you're asking need to be asked at every moment. I don't think that's going to stop CDR from being part of the equation, but we're going to have to use all of the things we're talking about: human rights, multiple tracks, maybe things like other notions of equity. For example, buyer take-back obligations, right? In Europe, for some products, right, we require that those that produce a product have to take it back, right? There's been some discussion of having mandates on large-scale producers of greenhouse gas emissions, not only to reduce their emissions, but also have to pay for carbon removal to remove legacy emissions, right? And that might help reduce the potential for moral hazard, right? But it's also going to be politically very difficult, right? Because it's going to increase cost, right? And so they're going to fight back, But I think those are the kind of things that we need to be looking at, but acknowledging that, no one should claim this has a place with the angels.
Okay, thank you for that answer. We have another question in the chat, which is, why not start by the source? For example, planes can also fly on hydrogen. Why are companies not investing in these technologies?
Could you say the first part again?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first part of the question is, why not start by the source? For example, planes can also fly on hydrogen. Why not invest in these technologies instead?
Yeah, well, it's not an either or. There is certainly been a substantial increase in research on hydrogen, right, including for applications like aviation, right, and a substantial infusion of funding by the Biden administration under the infrastructure bill, as well as the European Union, China, South Korea, for example, also have these projects. One of the challenges, of course, is moving from so-called brown hydrogen. If you're producing hydrogen using fossil fuels, or blue hydrogen, even if you're using things like natural gas, you're still it results in a large net increase in greenhouse gas emissions loads, right? You have to get to green. Green is the most expensive approach, right? But there's certainly efforts abreast to do it. There's efforts abreast to do it even by wedding it to some of these carbon removal approaches, right? For example, there is a couple of direct air capture plants that are seeking to utilize the captured CO2 in what they hope is a closed loop process to ultimately produce hydrogen, right, for all kinds of applications. So I don't think it's an either or approach, but that's a difficult question too, right? One of the things that I struggle with in this field, because I've been in the climate field for 40 years, right? But I've been in this field for, more than a decade, is acknowledging potential opportunity costs, right? If we're investing skills and money in certain approaches, right, are we taking it away from other approaches where we get more of a bang for the buck, or do we need them all, right? Or is it too early to determine which ones will bear the most fruit, right? That's a huge ongoing sort of challenge, I think, in the research community, But my feeling at this point is that there is sufficient amounts of money being put into hydrogen research that there's also room for a reasonable amount of carbon removal research and some concentric or converging rings where the two together might produce some results.
Great, thank you so much for that answer, Professor Burrow. It's really interesting to think about. We have a couple of comments in the chat that I think have been left by people who have left, but Professor, I obviously would love to hear your thoughts on them. So from David, he notes that the potential impacts on water use depend very heavily on how strategically forest is grown with respect to ET production and precipitation recycling. A more ET can be a good and a bad thing. It all depends. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on David's comments.
Yeah, no, he's absolutely correct, right? And quite frankly, has a lot more scientific expertise in that context than I do, right? But what I think it emphasizes is we need to ensure that we do this smartly, right? And a lot of those approaches, for example, can sometimes cost more money, right? And if we don't hold this community's feet to the fire by requiring like a human rights-based assessment, they're not going to do those things, right? They're not going to go with smart approaches. They're going to go with the cheapest approach, which, sometimes is also the smartest approach, but often is not, right? From a standpoint of protecting the environment or from the standpoint of protecting humans, right? My hope is that a human rights-based assessment lens will get them to ask the kind of questions David says we should be asking when we source bio feedstocks, right? And that we might not otherwise do. And the same with all of these other approaches, right? How do we get carbon removal, but how do we do it in a way that doesn't undermine the most vulnerable in our society, and acknowledge that may cost more money, but we need to do it from a standpoint of our human rights obligations.
All right, great. Thank you for that answer. We have another comment in the chat, I think also by someone who has left, but Kathleen comments that I would suggest that the UNGP on business and human rights implicates states in extraterritorial HR violations. So would love to hear your thoughts on this comment as well.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think that there's some question about whether that is a soft law sort of obligation, right? That doesn't necessarily provide the same kind of legal obligation that some of these other instruments do. But I think that's an excellent suggestion, and it's a particularly important suggestion because in a lot of these cases, maybe not all of them, but in a lot of these cases, the primary project developers are going to be in the private sector, right? When we talk about geoengineering writ large, right, and we talk about the other kind of geoengineering, solar radiation management, right, where we might be flying planes and trying to put sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight away, right? That's that's likely not going to make any money for any company, right? So if we ever go down that road, and I hope we don't, that's going to be a government thing, right? Marine cloud brightening, those kind of things, giant satellites, all these things. These would be government enterprises. But a lot of these things that we're talking about, direct air capture, for example, these are corporations, right? They're funded by other corporations in a lot of cases, right? The major direct air capture plants like that are run by companies like ClimateWorks are being funded by people like Microsoft, right? Or Stripe, or in some cases, fossil fuel companies, right? Which raises its own issues. And so any human rights obligations that have a direct implication for corporations are important. But as I said, some of these are soft law sort of obligations, and thus maybe more contested. But I think it's an excellent point.
That's amazing. Thank you. We actually have another question from Stephen in the chat. I invite Stephen to come off mute and explain his question. But he notes that geoengineering can have so many unintended consequences across borders, and this needs to be dealt with, but global cooperation is at risk due to economic competition, war, and a new Cold War. Is nuclear power more preferable to be a part of fossil fuel reduction? Wind and solar often have geographic location limitations. And Stephen, if you want to come off mute and add some context to your question or explain a little bit, we'd love to hear it.
Yes. Hi, Will. Good to see you again from our last encounter on a forum. Yeah, we've heard so much about geoengineering, and of course, this lack of cooperation we're seeing growing in terms of war, Cold Wars. You have Korea, North Korea, and all the things that are happening there. It would seem like nobody's going to really care about the implications of that. And then second part, it seems nuclear power, of course, is very beneficial for the northern climates where you're not getting as much solar energy. You may not have access to do that. There may be in remote areas, but is nuclear, being a better option, even smaller nuclear power plants that are more community based?
Yeah, again, I think at this point, again, for better or worse, most likely for worse, it's not an either or proposition anymore, right? I think nuclear has a role. Obviously, nuclear has some controversy associated with it, right? Cost, waste disposal, and so forth, right? But as you point out, especially some of the development of the smaller modular reactors, right, might help us with some of these things. I don't think there's any way we can't look at that option at this point, right? Given the fact that this is a extremely low or no carbon emitting source of power, right? But I don't think it can scale up quickly enough to preclude the need for CDR. If you look at the IPCC scenarios, for example, most of the scenarios incorporate some nuclear, right? That I think is realistic in terms of how quickly we can scale, but it's still at the end of the day requires large amounts of carbon removal, right? One of the things I want to emphasize is that, as you point out, there are risks with all of these things, right? Including these approaches, right? Every last one of these carbon removal approaches have certain kinds of risks, right? And I've tried to outline some of them here. But the more that we can decarbonize, the less of this we're going to need, right? So, for example, the IPCC says that if you only need carbon dioxide removal for the so-called hard to abate sectors like steel, aluminum, agriculture, then maybe you can scale yourself back to somewhere between 3 or 4 gigatons, right? That's still a lot. It's a tremendous heavy lift for society, but it's a lot less than what we're talking about in some of these scenarios, and it'll reduce your risk. It'll reduce the sustainability footprints, right? And the other thing is that we're going to have to be creative, right, in terms of addressing these issues. We need a portfolio response, right? We're going to need nuclear. We're going to need renewables. We're going to need, and I think a human rights approach can help with this, a portfolio of these approaches where we try to deploy each one of them at a scale that does protect human rights, that can be done sustainably, but cobbled together get us the amount that we need, right? Instead of focusing on one of them, perhaps that might effectuate the amount of sequestration we need, but has huge negative implications, right? And so if we can push people to think creatively, right, and to look at things that they may not have wanted to look at in the past, such as nuclear, right? We're better off as a society, right? Because we got ourselves into this situation now where there is no free lunch, right? And anybody who thinks there is engaged in magical thinking that I don't think is helpful.
Definitely, thanks. And that it's not going to happen overnight either. There's a process and there's a long time period associated with
it's right. Even decarbonizing, right, requires huge additional commitments to storage, right, for intermittent sources, and huge additional increases in the grid, right, for delivery, right. It's a transformation that takes place over decade upon decade, right? Think about how long it took to structure the economy that we have now, and then fundamentally restructuring it. Yeah, there's no magic wand, and so that's why when people say, "Well, we should just decarbonize the economy," it's just like it's too slow without looking at other options. And it's too little now because we put so much carbon into the atmosphere, right? The legacy implications of it also necessitate talking about these things, but trying to talk about them responsibly, hopefully.
Thanks. Great talk today.
Thanks.
Does anybody else have any questions that they would like to ask? Please feel free to come off mute to ask your questions, drop them in the chat. Well, I actually have a question for you, Professor Burns.
Sure.
And I'm curious, in the context of you were talking about sort of government regulations and the role of different political actors, ranging from the UN and soft law to the policies that governments themselves would like implement in within the boundaries of a state. But I'm curious what you think the role of an organization like the WTO is. For example, I'm thinking of like intellectual property considerations when we're thinking of expanding the access to CDR technology to the global South. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's a great question. I am not by training an intellectual property lawyer, right? So I'm going to try to not get in over my skis too much, right? But what I can say is give a shout out to somebody who is working a lot on this. His name is Josh Sarnoff, and he's a professor at DePaul University Law School in Chicago. And he's been looking at the intellectual property implications of CDR approaches, including issues of access, right? Because that's going to be a huge issue, as has it been with renewable approaches, right? And these Blythe mandates in my mind, Blythe mandates in the Framework Convention in Paris for technology transfer that often have not taken into account the imposing barriers that intellectual property pose, and not really trying to ameliorate them in any way, right? Because they are imposing, right? It's corporations fighting to protect profits, some of that reasonable, right? The R&D and that's required to do these things, the fact that most of them will fail, necessitates and justifies, right, a return on investment, right? But how you balance that, right, with the needs for meaningful access, it will be revisited in this approach also. And I don't think there has been much discussion of it beyond what Professor Sarnoff has been doing, but there really needs to be, or we're likely to find ourselves in the same places we have with a lot of the renewables, right, that are not sufficiently penetrating, in my opinion, in the developing world for that very reason that you're, I think, suggesting.
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you. And I think also the transnational considerations that you were talking about during your presentation, I think definitely come into play here. Anna, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to give an opportunity again, if anyone in the audience has any other questions they wanted to pose here, you can drop those in the chat or raise your hand here. We have a couple extra minutes. But if not, I also have a question I wanted to pose. You mentioned the importance of government regulations in your answers to some of the previous questions and also in your presentation. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate a bit as to what these policies may look like, especially given that any regulatory framework for BECCS would need to foster responsible oversight for safe and effective operations. So I'm wondering if you could speak to these implications for governments overall.
Yeah. Well, I think this could happen both at the international and the national level, right? There's been some effort to already regulate carbon removal approaches at the international level. For example, the London Convention, right? And the London Protocol that regulates dumping of materials in the oceans, passed resolutions related to one kind of carbon removal approach that we didn't talk about today, but is called ocean iron fertilization. And the idea is to put large amounts of iron into the ocean in the form of iron filings to try to stimulate phytoplankton production, to take up more CO2, right? As you can imagine, there is some concern about the ecosystem implications, right, of putting large amounts of iron in the ocean, right? And so the London Convention passed a resolution that said that you could only do it at a very small scale. You couldn't be trying to get money for doing it, right? Selling credits on the voluntary carbon market, for example, or under Kyoto, and that it was subject to a risk assessment framework, right? Well, in my mind, one of the things that London should consider is expanding the scope of that risk assessment framework to include human rights-based approach assessment, right? And so that could be folded in to that assessment process, right? And there'd be some overlap, I think, with what you would see in a traditional risk assessment, but there would be some additional elements and some additional, I think, stakeholders that would be brought into the process that might not have been taken into account otherwise, right? And I think that would be salutary. The CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, also passed resolutions when companies were engaged in ocean iron fertilization experiments in the last decade. It also calls for a risk assessment framework, right? And again, that could be incorporated into this process. The Paris Agreement, if it ultimately decides that part of one's NDCs, right, your pledges, right, can include CDR, and I think they will, right, because if you look at what the nationally determined contributions say, they say countries are to take domestic mitigation measures, right? And then you have to ask yourself, well, what does mitigation mean, right? Well, it's not defined in the Paris Agreement, even though it's used 18 times, right? But in the parent agreement to Paris, the Framework Convention, it says mitigation is reducing emissions or enhancing sinks, right? So I think CDR could be a mitigation measure in the future, right? But the Paris rulebook will likely have to develop rules, accounting measures and things like that for CDR. I think it could include, especially because of this preambular language that I've talked about that talks about human rights, a human rights-based assessment in any efforts to use it in the NDCs or under Article 6, right? Article 6 has these, is kind of baby Kyoto, right? It still contemplates the use of market-based measures, right? In Article 6.2 and Article 6.4. And you could see countries or companies, I could see, for example, establishing BECCS facilities in one country, like a sub-Saharan African country, and then claiming credits toward their commitments in Europe, right? The the Paris Agreement in establishing the rules for those market-based mechanisms could include human rights-based aspects, right? And then in the national level, because I know we're running out of time, but at the national level, again, the same sort of thing. There are opportunities, given the fact that all of these will be subject to environmental impact assessments already, to include the human rights component. Also, in a lot of these cases, they have procedural obligations, right? The need for public comment, for example. Those public comment periods should give us an opportunity to try to identify key stakeholders and try to ensure that those stakeholders are involved, right? So, for example, in the United States, some of the discussion now is coastal CDR off the northwest coast of the United States. That may have some implications, both positive and negative, for tribes that fish in those areas, right? So identifying key stakeholders, ensuring that they're part of the process, in my mind, both comports with other aspects of domestic law in most countries, but also could be elevated and amplified by emphasizing a human rights-based approach.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your talk today. I think it draws on a lot of the themes that we've been talking about throughout the school. It's a really nice closeout to the school itself. So thank you so much for that fascinating lecture. I learned so much, and I hope that the rest of the participants did as well. And so to close out, on behalf of GNHRE and UNEP, we want to thank you and all of you all for being here. This is our last panel of our School for Human Rights and the Environment. And we really want to extend our heartfelt thanks to all of the panelists, coordinators, and lecturers like you, Professor, who have participated in the school, and to all the participants who have come to listen, thoughtfully engage, learn, ask questions, make comments, and to be a part of our community here today.
We will be posting the videos of these sessions in the next few days. So please keep an eye out on our website if you missed the session and want to go back or just revisit some of the information that has been shared across this week. One last word of thanks to One Ocean Hub, who's been such a huge part of the school and helped us to conceptualize and design our program. And to the University of Southampton, who have helped us to host this event and have been such an invaluable partner throughout the entirety of the process.
Thank you all so much.
All right, and with that, we will call this 2022 School for Human Rights and the Environment to a close. Thank you all for all of your participation, and we will see you hopefully next year.
Thank you. Bye now.
Professor.